Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Kinda Murdery, a true crime podcast that's mostly about murder, and always about the strange and compelling stories that arise when the path less traveled twists to darkness, and those who walk its shadows surrender to violence and moral corruption. We have a perilous journey ahead, so thank you for lending me your courage and good company. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Now, my personal associations with the Easter holiday are overwhelmingly positive. Dyeing eggs as a kid, the joy of the egg hunt, and the clues that eventually led me to an Easter basket. The happiness continued into my adult years as a father, watching my daughter's face light up with joy as she followed Easter bunny clues of her own. Other things are great about Easter too. Gorging on baked ham, the start of the baseball season, the cleansing feeling of hope and renewal that comes with spring, and the lengthening of the days. I've got nothing but good things to say about the Easter bunny and his strangely incongruous holiday. Bunnies don't lay eggs after all. But I'm one of the lucky ones. Not everyone or everything has the same warm and fuzzy feelings that I do associated with huge humanoid bunnies. Bunnies can be dark too. My favorite stuffed animal as a kid was a fuzzy jackrabbit, appropriately if unimaginatively named Bunny, who I cuddled until he was threadbare and his foot came off. So it should surprise no one that Marjorie Williams' 1922 children's story, The Velveteen Rabbit, that is ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of cholera and culminates, spoiler alert, in the immolation of the title Bunny, left me emotionally scarred. And that was just a tiny toy stuffed rabbit. Setting aside just how violent Bugs Bunny can be when he gets his dander up, or the fact that my daughter is obsessed with Big Chungus, that's Chungus, Chungus, Big Chungus Eats the World is what the video's called, go ahead and Google it. It's worth pointing out that bunnies, especially giant humanoid bunnies like the Easter Bunny, seem to have a close association with human psychosis. There's the classic 1950 Jimmy Stewart movie Harvey, adapted from Mary Chase's play of the same name. In it, Stewart plays an eccentric named Elwood P. Dowd, who hallucinates a 6-foot-tall invisible rabbit friend named Harvey. The film's comedic misadventures begin when his sister attempts to have him committed to a sanitarium, because he's hallucinating a giant bunny, of course. Then, 2001 gave birth to the classic cult film Donnie Darko, starring Jake Gyllenhaal and featuring Fran Kranz, who's been a guest on this very show 3 times. If you haven't heard him yet, look for Fran's episodes, they're great. In Donnie Darko, the title character also hallucinates a human-sized rabbit companion. Although, unlike Jimmy Stewart's rabbit, this Bunnyman is explicitly creepy. And, speaking of creepy Bunnymen, today's episode consists of 3 stories compiled from 3 separate articles. The first is called The True Story of the Bunnyman, Northern Virginia's Most Gruesome Urban Legend, written for WAMU.org by Ali Schweitzer in 2017. Next, we'll move on to a Renaissance Easter murder, published on April 5th of this year for Fodors.com, entitled Murder and Mayhem Mark This Sacred Easter Site in Florence, and written by Rebecca Toy. And finally, we'll finish with a notoriously horrific Easter massacre, taken from an article entitled The Easter Sunday Massacre, Horrors and Hauntings of a Holiday Nightmare, published by www.americanhauntingsinc.com. As always, all my sources are in the show notes. So now, if you're ready, please join me as I uncover what truths I can and solve what mysteries I may. Kinda Murderies, Easter Bunnies and Blood, The Bunnyman, the Medicis, and the Easter Sunday Massacre starts now. We begin with the story of Virginia's Bunnyman. An urban legend that is associated with Halloween, and yet, by the very nature of the legend's title, The Bunnyman, an Easter association is unavoidable, and so I'm going to tell the story here. On Halloween night, don't go near that bridge in Clifton, Virginia. You could get snuffed out by the Bunnyman. According to local lore, the Bunnyman's Bridge is one of the most dangerous locations in Northern Virginia. Hang around there until midnight on Halloween, and you may be butchered by the Bunnyman. Every teenager in Clifton knows the legend of the Bunnyman. The story goes like this. In 1904, there was an asylum not far from the bridge. Clifton residents didn't like the idea of mental patients near their new homes, so they got the asylum shut down and all the patients were taken by a bus to Lorton Prison. Except the bus swerved and crashed. Authorities were able to locate all the inmates on the bus, except for one. The escaped mental patient was named Douglas Griffin. After the crash, he disappeared. Weeks passed, and rabbit corpses began appearing in the woods. Douglas was apparently eating bunnies to stay alive. This went on for a while. Then, one Halloween night, a group of kids were hanging around the bridge. They reported seeing some sort of bright light, or orb, and then in a flash, they'd all been strung up like bunnies, gutted, and hung from the bridge. The missing mental patient was, of course, assumed to be the killer. As the rumor goes, if you go by the bridge on Halloween night at midnight, you'll end up just like those bunnies. Of course, this sounds awfully unlikely. For one, there was never an asylum in Clifton, and for another, 1904 was an awfully early time for buses to be on roads. But it's been said that every urban legend is based on a kernel of truth, and the Bunnyman is no different. Here is what Fairfax County archivist Brian Conley says is the Bunnyman legend's genesis event. In 1970, some 66 years before the supposed origin of the Bunnyman, a couple was parked in a driveway not far from the train overpass when they had a terrifying encounter. Someone appeared very quickly, yelled something having to do with trespassing, and threw a hatchet at the car. The couple didn't get a very good look at the person. All they really got was that he or she was dressed in white or light-colored clothing and may or may not have had something on their head. When the story made the papers, that something on their head became bunny ears. From there, the story started to morph quickly. Within a few years, children were swapping stories about a man in a bunny suit chasing kids through the woods with a hatchet. Like a game of telephone, the story went from one person to another, taking on increasingly imaginative details. Today, the Bunnyman legend has traveled far beyond Fairfax County. There are Bunnyman t-shirts, Bunnyman beer, and a Bunnyman horror movie franchise. And even as Conley's research on the true story of the Bunnyman has circulated online, some people refuse to believe he's telling the truth. There are people who are convinced that the story, the urban legend as told, about the escaped mental patient is true, Conley says, and that he and Fairfax County are trying to cover something up. Conley himself admits that, while it's fun doing the research to debunk the Bunnyman legend, it's even more fun to believe it. I have to agree with him there. Here's hoping that worrying about the Bunnyman won't keep me, or any of you, awake on this Easter Sunday night. Alright, let's move on to our next story of Easter mayhem, the Medici Easter Sunday murder mob. Now, standing in the reverent silence of Florence, Italy's Duomo, it's easy to imagine the awe 15th century citizens felt at Brunelleschi's new and miraculous freestanding dome. Yet a very different scene filled the cathedral's cavernous hall on Easter in 1478. As the Catholic Mass moved to the sacred moment of communion for the thousands in attendance, jealous conspirators stabbed Florence's most influential and charismatic brothers. Today, if you walk through the wonders of the city's most famous sights, you can still catch glimpses of the murder that shaped its power and beauty. The rival Pazzi family's plot to overthrow the Medicis included power players from Italy's city-states, including Pope Sixtus IV. Initially, they seemed successful. Giuliano Medici was clearly dead, stabbed so many times that witnesses swore he was gone before he hit the cathedral floor. But a wounded Lorenzo Medici, the up-and-coming patron of the world-famous Renaissance artists and kingpin of the Republic of Florence's money machine, escaped deep into the cathedral. The chaos and bloodbath that immediately followed changed not only Florence but the entire political balance of Italy, from Naples to Milan. Wander the streets and think of the horror. Everywhere you see beauty and art that came from this family, meaning the Medicis, who were patrons of so many great artists. You see the art, but in truth, It was surviving a murder and coming out on top that made Lorenzo Medici il Magnifico, this according to art historian Claudio Romeo. Florence was the bank for most of Italy and Europe during the Renaissance, with plenty of resentful debtors. No family was more influential than the relatively new house of the Medici. Giuliano and Lorenzo's grandfather, Cosimo Medici, put Florence on the economic map. The proof of that soared above the city, the creation of Brunelleschi's miraculous dome that the Medicis championed. Even at 29, Lorenzo Medici was cunning and charismatic, a clever politician and poet. The people of the city loved him and his brother Giuliano. But the diminished Pazzi family was seething with jealousy and their own dangerous connections. In an age when it wasn't unusual to massacre your rivals at a dinner in their honor, the Pazzis set their minds to murder. It was hard to get to both brothers simultaneously, but killing one just wouldn't do. If one brother went down, the other could simply step into his place. So after a few postponements, the Pazzi conspirators agreed on Easter Mass at the Duomo. What might seem like sacrilege, what is certainly sacrilege, was easily soothed away, because the Pope was in on the plot, and the priests aided with the attack. Remember, this was an age in the Catholic Church where the Pope was essentially omnipotent, and you could functionally just buy your salvation. So no matter what sins you committed, no matter what the Bible said, if the Pope said it was cool, or if you gave the church enough money, you really didn't have to worry about your own damnation, or so they believed at the time. So, with the Pope and the priests backing their plan, the Pazzis had no concern for their immortal souls. Near the altar, in the Medici's place of prominence, the assault started. Giuliano, 24, was stabbed 19 times by a swarm of men. The priests attacking Lorenzo only managed to graze his throat before he was pulled away by a friend. Lorenzo and the friend fled to the sacristy on the left of the altar, barring the heavy door. Chaos erupted. Those in the back of the cathedral only knew something terrible had happened. People ran screaming into the streets. As fast as word could travel, the city's alarm bells began to ring. Giuliano was dead. Maybe Lorenzo was too. Most citizens did not know if they too were under attack. In the cathedral's piazza, where people today sip coffee, take selfies, and dodge tricky salesmen, citizens fled from the architectural wonder and scattered into the narrow streets. The worst of the bloodshed was about to erupt. While armed squads of Medici men raced to the Duomo to reinforce the family, the head of the Pazzi family, Jacopo, headed to the main piazza at the Palazzo Vecchio. Here, at the fortress-turned-palace-turned-government office, he called on the citizens of Florence to overthrow the Medici. Yet, as historian and author Lauro Martinez describes in April Blood, Pazzi was doomed. The papal reinforcements did not arrive in time, and the conspirators gravely overestimated Florentine resentment toward the Medicis. The city turned on them instead. The Palazzo Vecchio was built for protection and is as ominous as the Duomo is elegant. It's easier to imagine carnage here. Florentines hurled the first captured conspirators out of the second-story windows. Below, where modern visitors ponder statues like Perseus beheading Medusa, the frenzied mob waited. The crowd stripped and mutilated the bodies with a gruesome rage that put those statues to shame. More conspirators, including the Pope's nephew, were hanged from the ramparts of the palazzo. In the coming months, over 80 men were strung over the walls, many next to rotting bodies. Even the Bargello, today a sculptural museum with works from the Medici-sponsored artists like Donatello and Michelangelo, had bodies hanging when there wasn't enough room at the palazzo. Florence had resolutely chosen the Medici family. The Pazzi name was dead, stricken from records and forbidden in conversation. The Pazzi family crest was chiseled off the walls. Jacopo Pazzi was reburied many times as angry citizens would unearth him and prop his remains by the family door. Pope Sixtus set out to exact revenge on Florence with his army, yet Lorenzo managed to secure an unthinkable alliance with the ruthless king of Naples, startling even the kings of Spain and France. Rome stood down. The Medici, who as always used arts as a tool for propaganda and self-promotion, came out stronger than ever before. And art, most created by the geniuses that the Medicis cultivated, sprung up everywhere after these violent scenes. Lorenzo Medici commanded international respect as the balancing figure of Italy and no longer had to play a humble public servant. His famous Garden and Grove house sheltered and encouraged artists like Botticelli, Da Vinci, and Michelangelo, and he sent them to work in Rome, Milan, and Venice to make a point. He spread in Europe the image of Florence as the new Athens, the place where classical culture had come back to life. For their support, the Medici family was painted in some of the most famous works in the world. Infamous treason executions were painted on the walls of the Bargello Palace of Justice to shame the families who'd participated in the sacrilegious plot. If you look closely, you can still find defaced Pazzi crests. Conversely, you'll see the triumphant Medicis in art and name everywhere. The bloody dramas of an era that we now hold as the height of beauty are still hidden in plain sight. And let me just say that for the Pazzis and the Pope to think that an entirely Catholic country would be on their side after they arranged a brutal murder at the hands of priests at Easter Mass, I mean, that's the height of arrogance. The disrespect that shows towards people's religious beliefs is just pretty absurd. All right, let's move on to the Easter Sunday Massacre. The Ruppert House at 635 Minor Avenue in Hamilton, Ohio, is the scene of the deadliest family massacre in American history. Easter Sunday in 1975 was like any other in Hamilton, Ohio. Children hunted for eggs, mothers made last-minute preparations for family dinners, and entire families were dressed in new clothes to attend morning church services. For the Ruppert family, the day started out happy. They worshiped together at an early service and then gathered at 635 Minor Avenue in Hamilton, a middle-class community about 30 miles from Cincinnati. But what happened that afternoon, March 30th, 1975, went down in American history as the deadliest shooting ever to occur in a private home, and it left a grim and troubling haunting behind. James Urban Ruppert was born on March 29, 1934. His early life was sad and abusive. His mother, Charity, often called him a mistake because she'd wanted a daughter. His father, Leonard, was a violent man with a quick temper and little or no time or affection for his two sons. Leonard died in 1947 when James was 12, and his brother, Leonard Jr., was 14. Leonard Sr. wasn't missed. Jr. became the head of the family, and according to James, picked on him incessantly. James did poorly in school, had few friends, and was always smaller than his brother. As an adult, he was only 5 foot 6 inches and weighed 135 pounds. At 16, James was so unhappy at home that he attempted to take his own life by hanging himself with a sheet. He failed and resigned himself to an unremarkable life. Okay, I'm going to pause the story for just a moment. This is extremely tragic. To remind you, as I nearly always do, of the free 3-digit number, Lifeline number 988, that you can call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to receive immediate counseling for substance use, mental health, or suicidal thoughts. So if you find yourself in crisis, please do call 988. Program it into your phone now. And please do always remember that the world is a better place with you in it. All right, let's get back to the story. So James has unsuccessfully attempted to take his own life, and as he got older, his resentment for his older brother grew. James flunked out of college after 2 years, while Leonard earned a degree in electrical engineering and excelled in sports. To make matters worse, Leonard married one of the few girlfriends that James had ever had, with whom he had 8 children. Ouch. Leonard had a great job with General Electric, where James, at 41, was unemployed and living with his mother. On top of it all, James owed money to his mother and his brother, from whom he'd borrowed large sums after losing what little he had in the stock market crash of 1973 and 74. Charity, his mother, was frustrated with his inability to keep a job and his constant drinking, and she threatened to evict him. The threat seems to have been what finally sent James over the edge. On March 29th, James's birthday, witnesses later reported seeing him shooting at cans with a .357 Magnum along the banks of the Great Miami River in Hamilton. He went out later that night at the 19th Hole Cocktail Lounge, where he talked with employee Wanda Bishop. She later recalled that James seemed deeply depressed and talked about his mother's demands on him and her threat of eviction. He said that he needed to solve some problems. He left the bar at 11 p.m. that night and later returned. When asked if he'd solved his problem, he replied, "No, not yet." He stayed until the bar closed at 2:30 a.m. in the morning. On Easter Sunday, James' older brother Leonard and his wife Alma brought their 8 children, ranging in age from 4 to 17, to see their grandmother at the house on Minor Avenue. James stayed upstairs, sleeping off his night of drinking, while the children enjoyed an Easter egg hunt in the front yard. Afterwards, they came inside, and while Charity, Alma, and Leonard finished lunch preparations, the children played in the living room. Around 4 p.m., James woke up, loaded his .357 Magnum, 2 .22 caliber handguns, and a rifle, and went downstairs. He entered the kitchen, where he shot and killed Leonard, Alma, and Charity. His nephew David and his nieces Teresa and Carol were also in the kitchen. He killed them too. James then rushed into the living room, where he killed his niece Anne and his 4 remaining nephews, Leonard III, Michael, Thomas, and John. He killed each of his victims by first taking a disabling shot, and then finishing them off with a shot to the head or the heart. The massacre took less than 5 minutes to complete. Oh my God, this is awful. James sat in the house for 3 hours before he called the police. When they arrived, he was waiting for them just inside the front door. The police described the scene as a slaughterhouse. There was so much blood splashed about that it was dripping through the floorboards to the basement. To this day, stains can still be seen on the wood. The murders shocked the small community and made headlines across the country. Those who knew James never believed he was capable of such violence. He was a quiet, unassuming man and a perfect neighbor. James was arrested and charged with 11 counts of aggravated homicide. He refused to answer any questions and was very uncooperative. He made it clear that he planned to offer an insanity defense. Prosecutors believed that his plan was to plead insanity and then, after being cured, to be released to inherit the $300,000 that he would be entitled to as the only remaining living member of his family. The original trial was held in Hamilton. A 3-judge panel found James guilty of 11 counts of murder and sentenced him to life in prison. A mistrial was declared, and a second trial was held in Findlay, Ohio, about 125 miles north, because it was decided that James could not get a fair trial in his hometown. Sounds accurate. The second trial began in June of 1975, and prosecutors offered new evidence about James' target shooting and statements about, quote, solving his problem, unquote. In July, he received a new sentence of 11 consecutive life sentences in prison. James appealed, and a new trial was granted in 1982. Defense attorney Hugh D. Holbrook, convinced his client was insane, personally funded the hiring of expert psychiatrists from all over the country. On July 23rd, another 3-judge panel found James guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, his mother and his brother, but found him not guilty of the other 9 counts by reason of insanity. He received 1 life sentence for each guilty count, to be served consecutively. Between 1972 and 1976, the death penalty had been suspended in the United States as a result of a pending U.S. Supreme Court decision, so James could not be sentenced to death for his crimes. I just wanted to mention I'm not aware of the history of Ohio jurisprudence or how it works, but I've never heard of a 3-judge panel before. I thought everyone was entitled to a trial by jury, but if anybody knows, anybody in Ohio, if anybody knows the deal with this 3-judge panel thing, I would love to hear from you. Reach out to me, kindamurdery@gmail.com, or go ahead and call the Kinda Murdery hotline, 888-MURDERY, and tell me what's going on with these 3-judge panels. Also, please call 888-MURDERY to tell your Kinda Murdery story to inspire an episode of the show. Okay, let's get back to James Ruppert. So he was sentenced to 2 life sentences for the murder of his mother and his brother. Thankfully, those sentences were to be served consecutively and not concurrently. He was sent to the Allen Oakwood Correctional Institution in Lima, Ohio. He had his first parole hearing in 1995, but his release was denied. His second parole hearing in 2015, his release was denied again. And he died just last year on June 4th, 2022, while incarcerated at the Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. If he were still living, his next parole hearing would have been 2025. Going back in time now, to 1975, in the wake of the murders, James Ruppert's 11 victims were buried in the Arlington Memorial Gardens in Cincinnati. A year later, the house at Minor Avenue was opened to the public, and all of the contents were sold at auction. It was cleaned up, carpets were placed over the bloodstains that could not be removed, and it was rented out to a family that was new to the area and had no idea of the horrifying events that occurred there. The family quickly moved out. After leaving the house, they claimed to hear voices and strange noises that they couldn't explain. Lights turned off and on, doors slammed, and thudding footsteps were often heard coming down the stairs. They were not the last to move in and leave quickly. A number of other families moved in and out of the house, and none stayed for long. All of them reported sounds and voices that could not be explained. The house was abandoned for several years, but the last family that moved in reported nothing out of the ordinary. Whatever eerie haunting had plagued the previous tenants was finally over. Perhaps the echo of the shocking events of 1975, which seemed to leave an indelible mark on the house, had finally faded away. And perhaps now, after nearly 50 years, the spirits of the Ruppert family can finally rest in peace. Oh, that is one awful Easter story. I apologize. Well, happy Easter, everybody. I'll see you back here on Thursday, April 13th for another brand new episode. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.